Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, and welcome back. So excited to welcome you to the next panel in our two-day virtual symposium, The Vote, Reimagining What It Could Be. I'm Deondra Rose. I'm Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics here at Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy, and I am excited to introduce an all-star lineup. We, thus far today, have talked to political scientists who've helped us to make meaning of and make some sense of this current political moment and the longer trajectory of democratic inclusion, voter participation in the US and beyond. And we've also spoken to a number of student leaders and activists from multiple North Carolina colleges who've shared insights from their own work to increase voter participation. I'm really excited that in this session, we'll be able to hear from student journalists who can tell us a little bit about what it's been like to cover the 2020 election. So to help us do this, we are going to be led in discussion by Professor Mlyn, and I'm very excited to offer Professor Mlyn's biography, and you can find his biography as well as extended bios for all of our participants at our website, and we'll put that in the chat for you. Professor Mlyn is a distinguished faculty fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics and a faculty member at the Sanford School of Public Policy, both at Duke University. He was the founding executive director of the Duke Engage program and assistant vice provost for civic engagement at Duke University. Before that, he was the founding director of the Robertson Scholars Program and served on the political science faculty at UNC Chapel Hill. He's currently the director of the Certificate in Civic Engagement and Social Change, and he chairs Duke's Global Travel Advisory Committee. Professor Mlyn collaborates with colleagues across campus on the development and implementation of Project Citizen, which seeks to put the consideration of citizenship at the center of Duke's experience and the Duke community. His intellectual interests focus on the role of higher education in fostering democracy and working with undergraduates to foster political and civic engagement. He holds a BA in political science from Tufts University and a PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota. And we're very proud to also call him a member of the Polis Steering Committee. So Professor Mlyn, take it away.
Thank you, Deondra, for your generous introduction again of me. And congratulations on what has been a really interesting and provocative virtual conference. What an amazing time to be doing this. I'm really honored to be moderating this. I'm really glad that students from my class on engaged citizenship and social change, where we've been discussing a lot of these issues, are joining us for this particular segment of the conference, and I hope that they've attended other parts and will stay participating as you conclude the conference today. So what I wanted to do first is introduce our three student members of the panel. And first I'd like to introduce Chris. And Chris Koo is a sophomore studying English and political science with a PJMS certificate. He loves reading and writing, and one day he thinks he's going to write magazine profiles for the New Yorker, or hopes to write magazine profiles for the New Yorker. Chris, I'll ask you, who would be the first person you'll profile? We'll come back to that in a second. He has an incredibly, sometimes one should be careful about asking for life to be interesting, right? So he's been covering the North Carolina Senate race, which, as many of you know, has been one of the most interesting and important races in the nation, even before Senator Tillis got COVID and State Senator Cal Cunningham admitted to sexting with a campaign worker. So we're very eager to hear Chris's insights into the race. Thanks for being with us. Next, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Torrence. Rebecca is a Trinity senior majoring in neuroscience with a minor in linguistics and a certificate in journalism. She covers the in-person election process for the 9th Street Journal and writes features for the Duke Chronicle. I got to meet Rebecca the other day when we were planning the conference, and she'll have lots of interesting things to share with us. This summer, she covered local government for the Tampa Bay time. So look forward to talking to Rebecca. And then finally, Rose Wong is a Trinity senior studying political science, gender, and journalism. She's currently senior editor of the Chronicle. So interested to hear what you have to say, and is the mail-in voting beat reporter for the 9th Street Journal. And I'll ask folks to tell you a little bit about that as well. She worked as an editorial intern for the Tampa Bay Times. Is it right that both of you are with the Tampa Bay Times? Okay, great. So thank you all for joining. Looking forward to the conversation. So folks in the audience know we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will eagerly await questions from you. You can feel free to put questions in the question and answer as we're going along, and I'll field those and put them to our panelists. And as I said, just by way of introduction, covering this election is incredibly challenging. And in covering this election in North Carolina, which in many ways is seen as, and we're not just saying this because we live in North Carolina right now, as one of the most crucial places for this election, has given you all really a front row seat on democracy, right? And a front row seat on the role that the press plays in democracy at a time when, and I can't remember in my lifetime, and I'm almost 60, where the role of the press has come under tremendous scrutiny, where the term fake news has become part of the daily parlance. It wasn't like that 4 years. What was fake news? And it's something that we all understand. So really interested to hear what it's been like for all of you to operate under these very unique circumstances. So the first thing I want to do is start with, I'm going to start with each one of you, go to Chris, then Rebecca, and then finally Rose, and just say, what are you doing? And can you tell us a bit about your story or the beat that you're covering? And Chris, why don't you take some time to tell us about that? Hey
everyone, I'm Chris. I'm a sophomore here at Duke, and I'm covering the Cunningham-Tillis Senate race. It's a really fascinating race, definitely one of the most important races in the country. It could really decide the control of the Senate, whether it flips to the Democrats. So yeah, a little bit about my beat. Basically, what I do is essentially just stay up to date on the news, contact the different campaign officials and things like that, and really think about different stories that could provide an interesting new perspective on the race other than what's already in the news, I think. And so the most recent round of news has been all about the COVID first, with Tillis getting COVID, and then the sexting scandal with Cunningham that's still kind of unfolding. Right now I'm working on a story about trying to figure out what's the new perspective and a fresh take on this scandal that's unfolding right now.
Chris, how do you find a new take on something that's being covered by every journalist, not only in the United States, but around the world? Does that make your job harder?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. And as a student reporter, you don't have as much access, I think, to the campaigns and the candidates. And Cunningham's obviously not going to just have an interview about this right now. His campaign has largely gone dark. But I think what I try to do in talking with my professor is just thinking about what are the things that readers and that the public needs to know about this that isn't already provided. What are the behind the scenes things that goes on? We've floated around talking about opposition research and how that plays into the dynamics of this. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about what are the kind of the longer term and behind the scenes stuff that goes on that the day-to-day headlines don't necessarily pick up on. And those are equally important, even though it's not the hot take or the latest drop in the news. Right, okay. And who would your first profile for the New Yorker be about? Yeah, I had to think about that one. I would say Jimmy Chin. He's a wilderness rock climbing photographer. And so one of my hobbies is just to go out in the wild and rock climb and hike. And so I think I'd do that. Okay, great. Thanks. We'll come back to you and we'll have some more questions. Rebecca, tell us what you're doing now and a little bit about your beat.
Sure. So I'm covering the in-person election process, which the exact topics that have become most relevant have shifted really. They pretty much shift every couple of days. So when I started covering, the major issues were about poll workers and making sure that Durham County and all these other counties are going to be able to staff the polls and have the resources they need to actually hold the election. And then we've seen really a coordinated increased focus on poll watchers and voter fraud and the potential for voter intimidation at the polls. That's what my last two stories have been about. And now we're sort of thinking about shifting our focus to the election administration to kind of reframe what the election is actually going to be like and how we can trust the individuals that are actually running our elections. So, and I'm sure that we'll get into that as well, but that's been really interesting as well, sort of deciding how we want to frame this conversation and what we want to focus on, because what the media focuses on is like hugely important in what drives all this conversation and how voters think about what the election is going to be like. And so there's a lot of implications there.
Good. Okay, we'll come back to it. You've raised a whole bunch of really interesting issues, and we'll come back to that. Rose, tell us your role and what you've been up to.
Yeah, so my beat is mail-in voting, and mail-in voting has been an important part of our democracy since the Civil War, when soldiers re-elected Lincoln in 1864, but now it has come into mainstream discourse. Because President Trump has been saying that it would invite massive fraud and, quote, would lead to the greatest rigged election of all time. And B, because of COVID, and mail-in voting is supposed to reduce disease transmission. So my job is to look at how these different forces relating to mail-in voting will affect our upcoming election.
Okay. Good, and we'll come back so you can tell us how it will affect our election, or the final answer on that. But what I want to do is zoom out before zooming in again, and I'm going to zoom back in with each of you because you have each raised a number of really important issues. But I wanted you to reflect on, as you do your work now and sort through the various controversies about this election. What role, let's start with you again, Chris, what role do you think journalism plays for democracy? And how has this weighed on you as a journalist? Where do you fit the media into the overall fostering and health of American democracy? And how do you look at that as you approach your work each and every day? Chris, let's start with you.
Yeah, that's a huge question. I don't know if I can answer it in my 30-second spiel, but I think, like you said, there's never been a point, I think, where journalism has come under such attack from the very institutions of government that we have in the US. And so on the one hand, I think it's just this really challenging environment where the very act of truth-telling is labeled as partisan, right? But on the other hand, journalism has never been more important, I think, because citizens need to know the facts and the truth about what's going on in government, what political leaders are doing and how they're using their power or how they're abusing it. And I think in an era where there's so much misinformation, even from foreign countries, it's even more important that journalists really, their role is to provide that information, to provide that that facts that people can rely on, I think. And I think in democracies, especially where democracies depend on citizens making informed choices, it's really hard to do that if you don't have good and reliable information. And so I think we've seen things like Rebecca's beat with the election and the fraud and all that talk. I think that's really put into perspective the importance of providing clear information and clear coverage on what's actually going on. Is there actually fraud? And if there isn't, then why are people talking about it? And what is voters, how does that impact their choices as they go to the polls?
Good. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to come back with a follow-up question for all of you, because Rebecca, what do you think in terms of journalism and democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the point that Chris raised, especially about what I've been talking about on my beat, is very interesting because, especially with voter fraud, it comes to a point where you wonder, when are you just beating a dead horse? Like, when are you covering this issue so much that, like, people should know by now that voter fraud isn't really going to happen, like that it is very rare. And you can say, like, anytime you cover these accusations, you just have to have a line in the story that's like, experts have found that voter fraud like is very rare in the United States. And so I think that that has been like a major challenge, is, you know, addressing these things when they happen, addressing these claims, because they are news. And you're seeing the president and his campaign do things that have never been done before in an election, and in attempts to sort of undermine our institutions and the electoral process altogether. And so as journalists, I mean, we do have a role to figure out what's what in that, and if there are any reason for those concerns, and sort of try to calm people down a little bit where we can. But I think it's a very fine line between reporting on incidents like this, and considering that there might be incidents of voter intimidation, and that, you know, there might be attempts at voter suppression, et cetera. But also, like, trying not to instill more fear than there already is, because we have enough of that, frankly.
Sounds like a very hard dance.
Absolutely, it absolutely is.
Yeah, I'm sure you're learning a lot and trying to do that. Rose, what's your perspective on that question?
This question has weighed on me a lot in my journalism. Sometimes it feels like you try and you report and there's nothing you do will do any good. And the truth is, journalists alone cannot hold up democracy. The fourth estate is but one estate. And most journalists are not celebrities the way many politicians are, and we do not hold the kind of power that politicians have over their supporters. So when you have politicians who are denouncing capital T, capital M, the media, and actively pulling them away from looking for facts, it's really hard to do our job. So I guess this is a public policy event. So that's something to think about, is that, like, what politicians are telling their supporters and where they look for news is really important. Because we put news out, but you got to read it.
Yeah. So for the three of you, thank you all for the very honest and I think sort of current thinking. Like you're clearly struggling with this as you do your work. I wonder if any of you, and I'll just put this out to the three of you, would have advice to our audience, students and non-students, about how to be consumers of media at this moment. You talk about truth, you talk about facts. There's so much out there. What is the best way to lock out some of the noise that you're talking about and become an informed citizen, which is such a fundamental part of being a citizen in a democracy?
I would say one thing for me is that I think not all media outlets or publications are created equal, in the sense that there's some that use standards of journalism to a greater extent than others, and some that rely on better fact checking, better verification, and things like that. And so I think when I think about how I consume news and how I evaluate it, I look at the kind of standards that the newsroom itself has. And some newsrooms, frankly, just have better standards than others, and that influences the kind of coverage that they do, and whether it's more trustworthy or not. So I think that's one thing for me. Yeah, I would say that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Others have thoughts on this? Rebecca or Rose?
I think that this is such a hard question. I mean, this is like such a central question about like how to, you know, how do you be an informed citizen right now? And there's like actively a desire to make sure that you're not, or that you're, you know, informed on the wrong sort of thing. I think that there's not, frankly, a lot that I can say that hasn't already been said, but I will say, you know, consuming like a variety of different sources of news. Bias is not necessarily a bad thing, as long as you know that it's there and the reporter knows that it's there. You just have to be really, like, you just have to be careful, and you have to know exactly what it is that you're consuming. And don't just read the headlines. I think that is something, especially with, you know, the rise of consumption of news on social media, that is something that we all fall prey to, because it's a really easy way to sort of like get a snapshot of the day. But if you come across something that you're like, oh, this is a big story, or like, you know, you think, oh, maybe I'll talk about this later in the day. It would be helpful to read the article and to sort of like get a little more context, because I think that that's a huge part of what's missing right now, is context and just sort of like fitting all these pieces into the greater conversation.
Rebecca, I think that your advice to not just read headlines is so important right now, because given the way we consume news, and you know, Twitter, for example, very few people follow the link, but will look at what the claim is, and I think that's across the board. Rose, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the last thing I would add to that is I highly encourage everyone to read local journalism and to subscribe to your local newspaper. There are a lot of very hardworking and underpaid people across the country who are trying to inform you about what's going on in your hometown. And a lot of times people say, I feel like this is not covered enough. Why aren't we talking about this? Well, probably your local journalists are hard at work reporting on that. And you should just pay for a subscription. And a lot of national stories from New York Times and Washington Post they found those stories from a local newspaper.
Yeah, that's great advice. And local news has suffered with the rise of the internet and the economic pressures on journalism. And it's interesting. I've noticed across the board something new in journalism, which is from the New York Times and their sort of blips on their podcast, The Daily, which I tend to listen to the Indie, which is our local Triangle, Durham-based news, arts, culture, politics newspaper. They justify paying for journalism as a public service. In other words, you should pay for this because we are an important part of democracy. That's new. It used to be they were profit centers and people would pay for it. But now with so much free content out there, they're actually saying you are doing a public service by paying for this. That's a really interesting change in the model that I've noticed across national and local media that we all can play a part in by paying for it. And sometimes you don't have to. Well, thank you for reflecting on that. All right, what I want to do now is I took a step back. I want to zoom in. And Chris, so eager to hear what you think about the texting situation. You know, in some ways it strikes me that President Trump contracting COVID, the vice presidential debate, and all the other noise out there may actually have been crowding out what might have been a front page article in the New York Times. I don't think this was, maybe it was. So what do you know about this, and what's your sense of the impact that it might have on the race?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I definitely agree with you that it hasn't gotten as much traction as otherwise you could have seen if there wasn't the president getting COVID, TLS getting COVID, all these other crazy developments. Also, I think I've looked at some of the most recent polls, still very preliminary, but they don't show a huge change in the race. Cunningham still has a slight lead over Tillis. And I looked at one poll from the Public Policy Institute, I think, and what they said was of non-Trump voters who saw the news, about 80% said it wouldn't affect their position on Cunningham. And so whether that's a reflection of the polarization that we're in North Carolina, and North Carolina is interesting because it does really reflect the national polarization in the the rural or urban divide that takes place across the nation. Whether it's a reflection of that or a reflection of just the ways that like sexual scandals don't have as much traction in a world where the president has paid hush money to a porn star, things like that. I think politics has changed in that regard. And one of my classmates, she brought up a good point the other day, was if this was more of a Me Too kind of scandal where Cunningham was involved in some kind of sexual harassment or abuse, I think this probably would have gained more traction. It's hard to know the counterfactual, but that's an interesting possibility to consider. In terms of where it's sort of at, so Arlene Guzman-Todd, she's confirmed that the affair took place in July in North Carolina, in at least one in-person incident. Now her husband has actually come out and called for Cunningham to drop out of the race. The Charlotte Observer recently reported that it doesn't seem like it's legal for either candidate to drop out at this point, but that's what the husband's calling for. And then another interesting development is the Army Reserve is actually conducting an investigation into Cunningham. Todd's husband is a veteran, and then Cunningham is also a service member in the Army Reserve. So I think the question is whether the affair took place the same time that Cunningham was on duty. And so that could involve some form of infraction, possibly a reduction in rank, forced retirement, things like that. And so it's interesting because Cunningham has played up his military background to a large extent. A lot of his ads have focused on how he's had a Bronze Star, he's fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I think that's a damaging aspect if he loses the credibility of their military reputation. And you've seen Republican ads already take up this issue. I've seen one from the Senate Leadership Fund, seen one from the Tillis campaign. They're definitely picking up on this. And so the question to me is, how much of this is still going to unfold as the rest of October and the beginning of November plays out? And how much is it going to actually gain traction in voters' minds? So if it comes to totally dominate the rest of the race, then I think that could be really politically damaging to Cunningham. And like I said before, you've already seen his campaign kind of gone dark. He canceled some fundraising events, a virtual town hall I think he had planned on Monday. And Tillis has been calling him to stop canceling events, to really come forward and provide a quote unquote thorough explanation. And so, yeah, that's not obviously something Cunningham wants to do. So that's really where I think the state of the race is right now. I don't think too many voters have changed their minds yet, but it's hard to know how much it's going to damage Cunningham in the future.
Chris, do we know how this got into the news?
Yeah, so National File was the organization that originally provided the screenshots, and they're definitely a conservative media organization. And so without going into too much detail, basically my story is kind of looking into how opposition research could play a role possibly. We have no substantial evidence for that, but it has a lot of the markings or the characteristics of opposition research. But to add another point,
our listeners, what opposition research is?
Yeah, so in my preliminary understanding, I'm still doing my research, but opposition research is basically when a campaign or a political group does research on an opposing candidate in opposition, and to basically dig up any dirt that they can find. So things like infidelity or tax evasion, anything that could provide potential negative advertising. But I read this recent article from David Graham, who teaches in the DeWitt program here at Duke. And in an Atlantic article about this, he talked about how Cunningham was supposed to be the boring candidate. Like, he wasn't supposed to have these spicy moments, right? And so I think that's part of why Democrats chose him in the primary rather than Erica Smith or the other primary challengers, is because he is this kind of mild-mannered, very run-of-the-mill, central casting kind of guy. And this is definitely not something they expected from him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And we'll look forward to your journalistic insights on it. Rebecca, let me just drill down a little bit into the issue you're covering and sort of, administration of elections, poll workers. If you were to get on the phone with a relative of yours from out of state and they said to you, so tell me, how does North Carolina look in terms of the security of its elections coming up in November? What's your general take on that?
I think we're doing pretty well. Durham is good on poll workers. Apparently they had to turn some people away. Like, they're pretty solid. I've spoken extensively with the election administration here. They're very meticulous. I'm confident that it is going to go smoothly here. The issue of absentee ballots, which of course is a little more in Rose's wheelhouse, and sort of all the legal challenges that have been surrounding it, makes everything a little more complicated, right? But I think that it's less complicated than people want to think. It has, of course, never been as common as it is right now. It is such a huge deal, but the administration has been working, and just the State Board of Elections in general has been working for months to make the system work. And they're making constant adjustments, but it seems like it's working okay. So I think that, you know, as far as is North Carolina ready? On the whole, I would say yes. I think that if we are to be concerned about anything, it would be the more rural counties. But, you know, I think that that's kind of, it's difficult to say, especially at this point. You know, maybe we'll get a little bit of a better idea moving forward, but I would definitely say that the chaos is sort of like peripheral to the election, doesn't reflect how the election is actually going to go down and what the people who are running the election have done to prepare for it.
And for those people in the audience who are planning on voting in North Carolina, what advice would you have for them?
Plan when you're going to do it. So pick a day, especially if you're going to do early voting, which I would recommend. I would say early vote, don't go on the first day, pick a date and time and like schedule it in. You can bring friends. And I think that makes it a lot easier for people, is to just sort of like put it in your calendar and be like, this is what I'm doing. And this is, you know, this is exactly when I'm going to go. That's what I've seen a lot of people doing. And so that's definitely what I would recommend. Yeah. And then as far as absentee ballots go, I think that is, you can track your ballots. It's pretty user friendly right now. So Rose can speak a little bit more to that, but I would say both of them are pretty good options. But either way, figure out exactly what you're going to do.
Yeah, and that, I think that's really good advice. And just as a reminder to those who are listening, tomorrow is the last day for voter registration in North Carolina, unless you decide to register through early voting, which you can also do, though there's increased identification requirements. Early voting will begin October 15th, runs through October 31st. And for those of you who are Duke-based, we will have a site at the Karsh Alumni Center on Duke's campus. The hours are quite extensive, almost every day, including Sundays. And there will be 14 early voting sites across the county of Durham. And one can vote in any early voting site. It's not like the election where you have to vote in your precinct. So just that as a public service announcement for voting. And Rebecca, I appreciate your level-headed perspective on this. Your role as a journalist here, at least in part, is to get rid of some of the noise, I think, and try to look at what's happening. Rose, you have a little more insight on the mail-in part of this? I know that's been something that you have been specializing in. And let me also, just as Rose is getting ready to answer, continue to welcome questions from the audience. One has come in. I'm going to get to that shortly. And if others have, please feel free to post those in the question and answer.
Yeah, so mail-in voting has been such a hot topic that everyone from the New York Times to WRAL have been covering. Part of my job has been figuring out where I, as a student journalist who's not working a full-time journalism job, can fit in with my coverage. And right now, something that I'm really interested in and concerned about is our cure process, which is what happens to a ballot that has a mistake in it. So history professor and voting rights activist Gunther Peck came to our class that Chris, Rebecca, and I are in, and told us that 1 in 7 ballots get thrown out historically in Durham County. They're just not counted. So now we have a process where voters can cure it through signing an affidavit, which just signature, date, but obviously everything has a loophole. Most ballot mistakes is incomplete witness information. And because when you do an absentee ballot, you need to have a witness proving that you are a valid person voting. And on September 22nd, courts said that you can sign an affidavit and fix a ballot with incomplete witness information, even though that wasn't the case before. And then 2 days later, a Republican appointed judge said, no, actually, we don't want to fix incomplete witness information with an affidavit. We actually don't know what we want to do with that. So right now, we're just going to hold those ballots with incomplete witness information. And we're going to figure it out at some point. So there's a temporary restraining order on that settlement. So this is really confusing for voters, what's going to happen to their votes, really stressful for our democracy, because right now there are ballots that are on hold that we don't know if they're going to be counted. We don't know if those voters will need to submit another ballot, or yeah, we don't know what's going to happen with that. So that's something I'm really interested in. Obviously, there'll be more developments as Republicans and Democrats fight it out in courts. And I would say what Rebecca said is to go vote early in person.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for that. You illustrate the complexity of the issue, right? Fair voting, but then how do you implement that gets more complicated. Let me ask you maybe just one more question before we go to our audience, and that is one of the in thinking about the role of journalists, something that I've seen as people are trying to ensure that we can do all that we need to have a peaceful transition of power in November, and there's some questions about that. One of the things that experts are urging is the role of the media, and that the media should not declare a winner too early. I wonder if each of you can reflect on that a little bit, given what you know about the media and the pressures on the media to be the first in an environment where there's so much media, balanced by the pressures on the media to play a responsible role and not declare a winner too early. That winner too early is the sense that maybe President Trump may win in the in-person voting, but once mail-in voting counts, which may take weeks and weeks and weeks, he would not be the victor. So what do you think the responsibility is of the media on that? I'll throw that out to all three of you.
So I may have sort of an unpopular opinion on this, but I actually think the issue of whether or not Trump is going to contest the results of the election is getting way too much coverage, because I think it's crazy. Like, it's genuinely insane that this could happen. And I think that like, he shouldn't have the power to do that. He doesn't have the power to do that. A peaceful transfer of power has to happen. And the more that we keep considering, to some degree, like, maybe he won't give it up, the more that when he doesn't, if we're going to assume that he doesn't, the more it'll just be like, cool, so this is what we expected all along. And it won't be, wow, you really can't do this. So that's sort of my take on that. As far as the media declaring a winner goes, I think that's a really fair question, right? Because there are different estimates floating all around about how long it's going to take for all of the absentee ballots to be counted. We do know that, with more people like voting early and like ballots already coming in incredibly large numbers across the country, that perhaps it won't be so like everything to the last minute as we think. So I think that, yes, like, the media has to be cautious But I also think there's no way that there's no way that there are just going to be papers that are like, well, like this candidate has like a huge lead, but like we'll see what happens, and it's like November 4th. I think that you still have a responsibility to share that information and see how everyone reacts. But definitely, like, we will have to be very cautious about that and not jump straight into analysis like directly after the election, as you would be able to in a non-pandemic election.
I'm going to add to that. I don't have a definite answer to that very large question, but I will say with the advent of the internet and how that has become more and more important to newspapers, with needing to be the first to get out there and to be the first to come up on the Google search, I think that has ultimately hurt the quality of journalism. And the idea of, yeah, let's just like throw out 2 or 3 sentences, even though we really don't know anything, and publish that, and then we'll like add more stuff later, just so they could be at the top of the Google search. And I know the Chronicle is doing that, and also I was listening in on conversations at the Tampa Bay Times where I was interning this summer. They were talking about needing to do more of that, even though seasoned journalists felt that that really compromised the quality of the journalism that they're putting out, just so they can be the first to get out there. And that just comes with the territory of the age of the internet.
Yeah, I would add to Rebecca's point about how the media is reported on Trump challenging the electoral process. I think part of the reason the media has jumped on that is because of the very fact that it's so unprecedented and so surprising. So I think there's that tension of how much do you report on it and provide too much coverage versus this is something that no sitting president, no incumbent president has ever done before in history. And so I think that's a tension that journalism is still working through. And in terms of whether we should report about the preliminary results of the election, I think in my mind, it goes down to what is the overarching purpose for journalism in a democracy? Because I mean, as with everything, you have to consider, what's the higher goal here? The goal is not just reporting on the latest headlines. The goal is not just generating more coverage to make more revenue, even though that's the business standpoint of it. But I think the higher goal is providing the information that the public needs to make the choices that they need to make in a democracy where those choices are possible. In this scenario, I think it depends on, I think each newsroom has to consider for itself what's the information the voters need, and that should tailor their coverage as they cover the election. I think it's a complicated process. I think I'm in favor of providing as much information that there is out there and letting voters make the judgments based on that information, but it's by no means an easy choice.
Right. Good. Okay. Let me go to a couple of questions from our audience. Some really interesting ones are coming in. First, Chris, this one's more for you, but I welcome anybody who wanted to tackle it. Earlier in the conversation during the panel, Chris, you mentioned newsroom standards, and this attendee is asking, where can we find information about the newsroom standards that Chris was talking about? How do we look for nonpartisan, not non-biased sources of information?
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is biased on my part, but I usually just go to the top news organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, because I know these are institutions that have been around for hundreds of years. I know they have a culture that's a certain kind of culture that values facts and verification, relying on reputable sources and things like that. And so I think I trust them based on that. And there's also, I'm sure, web pages that you can find. I don't have off the top of my head the links to those. But I would say, again, all those, even the New York Times, people have accused the New York Times of a certain form of bias. Journalists are human. Journalism is a human transaction. And so something we've talked about in our class is that it's impossible to be totally non-biased. Otherwise, it would just be like machines transcribing information. But because it's through human conduits, there's going to be a certain level of bias, if you want to call it that. But we do the best job we can, and we rely on reputable sources. We stand by those standards of journalism and of journalistic ethics, and we do the best we can using those.
Good. Either of you have, that's very helpful, Chris. Either of you have something to add to that? How do you find it? How do you know the where do you find those that have high standards?
Same as Chris, I don't know where exactly you would find this, but there is this like diagram that sort of like lays out all of these, like the major news organizations on this giant scale from like left-leaning to right-leaning. I think that's really helpful because you can see like there are organizations that are right down the middle. The New York Times is pretty close to like that area, so is the Wall Street Journal. I think as well, one of the difficult things in that arena is that opinion journalism sometimes gets conflated in there, because if you see like a liberal opinion from the New York Times, you might be like, okay, so the New York Times is liberal. And that's not accurate, right? Like you have to be careful about what kind of articles that you're reading and what are interpretations of the news and what is just the news, like what is reporting that is intentionally objective. So I would say that like it's totally fine to read opinions, again, as long as you know that they are opinions. But I mean, I think this is a challenge that people are facing around the world. It's sort of across the U.S. that of not knowing, you know, where to find nonpartisan sources. But I think that, frankly, I think that's more of calling into question journalism more than is necessary. Like I think that they are right in front of you. And you know, you don't have to look that hard to find genuinely good standards.
Good.
I'll also add that I think a lot of knowledge is relational. Like we trust certain facts and knowledge because we trust the speaker. And so I've also just collected a list of different writers across the New York Times, New Yorker, different people like that who I know, like I really trust these writers. I know they do their due diligence in hunting after the information, the facts. And so I would encourage listeners to do that as well. Just find people that you trust and really pay attention to their work as well.
Good, good. Let me go to a question from one of the students in class. This is a kind of personal question. I really like it. As student journalists, have you faced any negative feedback experiences from the public? And how do you deal with that? And how do you navigate the difficulties of covering topics that may be in opposition to your own beliefs? Any of you can tackle that one.
So last year, for the Chronicle, I did a reported column about student health, exposing a pattern of misdiagnoses and inadequate care. And it starts from my own experience being misdiagnosed. I had cancer and they told me that I had gas pains, and I talked to a bunch of other students who were misdiagnosed, and I got overwhelmingly positive response from people who were like, I also had the same experience, which really like fueled the reporting further. But also there were some people, in the administration who did not like the column, which made it very difficult, because as a student journalist who's like just learning journalism and figuring out this is what you want to do with your life, and there's a lot you don't know about what's like journalism ethics, it's like very scary to have an adult or adults tell you like what you're doing is bad and you need to stop. So that was scary, but when things like that happen, whether it's from the public or from authority figures, it just makes you double down further on you really have to believe in what you're reporting. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that personal story with us, Rose.
Yeah, I would say I haven't faced as much of the like public opposition, but I can answer the second part of the question about just when you're reporting, how do you balance your own personal views? Um, and yeah, it's definitely difficult, especially when you're doing political journalism, which is something I've just recently gotten into this semester. I would say, again, it's I think abiding by those standards of journalism of, you know, if you're reporting on one side, reaching out to the other side for comment. Um, and I think it's a tension between sometimes we don't want to do the sort of thing where we're just providing equal voices in a way that might elevate really extreme voices that don't deserve those kinds of platforms. Um, but again, you want to be fair and accurate, I think, is the key. So it's an ongoing thing. Like, I haven't fully worked through it. It's something I'm still figuring out how to do. But I think when I do my coverage, and this is something we've talked about in class as well, is when we're coming to different communities that perhaps have different views than our own, just coming as individuals, as humans, and saying, like, I'm not coming from this mainstream media outlet or from fake news. I'm just coming as Chris, myself, to learn about your story, to get to know your community, to learn about and experience your side of the world and the perspective. And I think that gets to something that's really concerning to me when I look at the kind of news and media ecosystem, is that there's sort of two worlds that are forming, the very conservative and the liberal side, whether it's Fox News and the liberal counterpart, is that people are taking in information that's really diametrically opposed. And so it's basically two alternate realities that are forming. So I don't have an easy answer to how to bridge that gap when the two sides don't really trust each other beyond, and maybe this goes back to Rose's point of trusting local journalism and reaching out to your local communities, and being human empathetic towards your neighbor who might have a drastically different perspective than you do.
Right. And you may face the issue, Chris, without my presuming what your politics are. Let's say that you are a Democrat and you support, and you're going to vote for Cal Cunningham. How much do you cover this scandal, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
That kind of situation can really bring up important issues. And just the way you're speaking about this and the wisdom that you're bringing to it gives me a lot of confidence that you're going to make the right decision. But hard ones. They could be hard ones.
Yeah.
Let me go to another question from a student in my class. With the increase in mail-in voting and absentee ballots, how long can we expect until we know who the next president will be? What's your sense of this in the circles that you're traveling in and what you're reading and hearing? What do you think we should expect?
Well, for North Carolina, if your ballot, if you're doing mail-in voting, if your ballot was postmarked by November 3rd, it doesn't matter if it takes until November 12th to get to the County Board of Elections. So which means it takes them that long to get all the ballots, and then it takes time for them to count them all up. And so I would say at least days, maybe weeks, definitely not what Trump said at the first debate, which was months. But I don't have a precise answer about that.
Chris or Rebecca, you have any guesses or educated guesses on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a hard question because all we can do is speculate, right? Because we don't know how many people are going to decide to cast their absentee ballots in like the week before November 3rd, or, you know, like on the couple of days around it. It's definitely not going to take months. I think that's fair to say. I would say like we're probably going to have November 3rd. We're going to have a good idea, and then it'll take like a week or so to like really confirm those results. It will really depend on how tight the margin actually is. And I don't think we're going to, you know, maybe it'll be one of those things where the margin is super tight until like the absentee ballots come all the way through. Maybe the result switches. We're just gonna have to wait and see, frankly. But I would say you know, if we don't have like the correct idea on the night of November 3rd, like that next week probably.
Okay, Chris, you have a different take, or?
No, I think similar. I agree with both of them, and I really hope that it doesn't take that long. I mean, 2020 continues to surprise me, so I'm not gonna rule it out of the realm of possibility that it does take longer, but I certainly hope it doesn't.
We're just about near the end of time. We have a bunch of really good questions. I want to, and maybe really briefly, and this is, I don't know, this is a totally unfair question, but before returning this back to Professor Deondra Rose for the next panel, what's the next story we haven't thought of yet?
That's a tough one.
I know. Yeah, just imagine if we had this last week, would any of you have said, well, President Trump will get COVID and will, you know, well, maybe you would have, but any creative guesses?
Wait, is your question, what's the next crazy thing that will happen in 2020?
Well, could be.
I'm going to say some foreign policy crisis. We haven't had enough of those yet in 2020, so.
That's actually a great point. Yeah, I'll have to agree with that. I think there's going to be some sort of like something overseas that really throws us all off.
That's an interesting one. North Korea?
Always a possibility.
Always a possibility. Rose, you have any conjecture?
Mike Pence eats the fly? Like, I don't know. It is an unfair question. I agree.
Yeah, it's an unfair question. I thought it was playful and unfair, and I claim the prerogative of the moderator. But, you know, I think there's no better way to end this panel than on the notion of Mike Pence eating the fly. And I'm really grateful for the three of you for your openness, and for your wisdom, and for your hard work, and for being the fourth estate, and for bringing sensibility and fairness, and your earnestness to this process. For those of you who are listening, I think Professor Rose will comment on this a little bit, but very much welcome you continuing to attend what's going to be an interesting end to the conference. So Deondra, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. And I just want to say to Chris, Rebecca, and Rose, thank you for the work that you're doing and for taking the time to share it with us. I have to say, I wasn't expecting so many spicy moments during this conversation, particularly including that last question. I mean, yeah, the fly is on everybody's mind. And Professor Eric Mlyn, thank you so much for amazing moderating. Thank you for being a part of this event and for inviting your students and all of the members of our audience. Thanks for being with us. Hope you will join us for the next conversation. We're having an amazing session from the Heart Leadership Program and its students who are presenting democracy work that they've been working on. You will not want to miss that. So please join us right back here, same place at 3 o'clock. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much for being with us. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.